this is a special education and outreach session on data and democracy with Dr. Salvatore Babones, or Professor Salvatore Babones. He's an associate professor at the University of Sydney, a columnist for the Quadrant magazine, and the executive director of the Indian Century Roundtable, a think tank. Many of us in the required reading, in the background reading we did for Professor Babones' visit, we know about his more popular interactions in the Indian media sphere about democracy indices. So we won't really be talking about that all too much, but we will be focusing on his professional background and experience as a quantitative sociologist. And coming from a more traditional Indian educational mindset where we might be used to a compartmentalization of academic disciplines, science, arts, commerce, Dr. Babones has a very interesting background. He has his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in sociology, but he also did a Master of Science in Engineering in the mathematical sciences. So our first question to you, Professor, is can you just tell us what quantitative sociology is, and a little bit about your journey getting into this field? How do you develop an interdisciplinary mindset, and what advice would you give to young Indians hoping to enter the field of quantitative sociology? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. The main body of quantitative sociology, and indeed quantitative social science in general, is concerned with survey research and the analysis of survey data. That's not my area. My own little niche is what's called macro-comparative methods. So I've written a book on methods for quantitative macro-comparative research, and by that I mean units that are not individuals. So the typical unit would be a country. So there are a series of statistics that have been developed for the analysis of databases where, like the World Bank's World Development Indicators or the OECD databases, where the country is the unit of analysis, but the same statistical techniques would be used if you're studying, say, the United States, and your 50 states are the units of analyses. So units that are not themselves, units that are geographical entities, not individual people. That's a small slice of quantitative social science, but it's my particular slice. It's the one that I enjoy working in. There was a follow-up question.
We have some more follow-up questions, but
no, I mean you asked several questions, and I always remember the first question. And
yes,
so
what advice would you give to anyone entering this field, and how does it relate to having an interdisciplinary mindset? Because computation and sociology might be very different.
So first, that's not in itself interdisciplinary. Social science in the United States is roughly a 50-50, quantitative, qualitative split. Now, in the British influenced world, so in Australia, Hong Kong, India, United Kingdom, sociology and social sciences tend to be highly qualitative. That's changing. It's especially changing in the UK, but that's where it is today. In the United States, however, and in Germany and the German-speaking Europe, social science is a very quantitative field. So if you want to get into sociology, typically you would have to do at least a couple semesters of statistics, no matter what area you're going to study in sociology, just to get the literacy of being able to read a typical journal article in a sociology journal. Now, the reason I went deeper into the statistics is I quickly realized that the people teaching me statistics in the social sciences themselves did not really understand the statistics, and I was unsatisfied with that. I wanted to get a more serious grounding in what the techniques we were using actually meant at a mathematical level. And so I did the Master's in Applied Mathematics, Mathematical Sciences at Johns Hopkins, which at Johns Hopkins is an engineering degree. That's why I have the Master of Science in Engineering. And that means that my wife wants me to put together furniture and things because she says, well, you're an engineer, you should be able to do it. But the reality is, for me, that's not interdisciplinary. That's just part of doing the social science I do. Now, that said, I am very much an interdisciplinary social scientist, which is to say, I take the Comtean view that Auguste Comte is the person who coined the term sociology in the early 19th century. And he was a philosopher, not a sociologist. The field didn't exist at that point. But he envisaged sociology as being an integrative social science that would take findings from anthropology, political science, and economics and integrate them into a broader view of how society works. And that's my own inspiration for how to do sociology. Of course, that really annoys anthropologists, political scientists, and economists when people like me wade into their fields. But I view that as the proper role of sociology. But again, I want to caution people, it's a small group of us in sociology who see the field as an integrative social science. Most of sociology today, and particularly most of American sociology, focuses on the study of race, class, and gender in the United States.
No, thank you, Professor, for that very illuminating overview of the field. And we, fortunately enough, have an in-house professional sociologist, Dnyanada Deshpande, part of our advisory board. She's Chief Relations Officer at the Deshpande Foundation. And I'll invite her to take control now and steer the next segment of this conversation, now that the team has a 101, a primer of what quantitative sociology is. Over to you, Dnyanada.
Thank you so much, Abhishek, and thanks for that introductory question. It was wonderful to listen to Professor Babones, because I'm no sociologist, but I'm a student of sociology, and all he said actually resonated, because most of our curriculums in India were focused on qualitative methods, rather more anthropological and historical than quantitative methods. Just as taking a segueing into the next question from that, is today there are two sides to the data study. One is you look at the data and actually look for the insights that data shows up. But there are also other narratives, and you demonstrated in your critique of the democracy indices that you can have the data, but then you choose what kind of perceptions you want to build basis that data. So could you just elaborate on that a little bit more, that data exists, but then the interpretations are highly subjective? How do we kind of avoid this glitch, and how can we keep on track of getting an objective to an extent insight from the given data? And how we ask questions also matters, and that would be my next question. But first, I would like to understand how to kind of negotiate this trap.
Look, there's been a culture shift in the social sciences away from the idea that a social scientist is necessarily subjective but strives for objectivity, to a stance where the social scientist embraces subjectivity. Now, again, at risk of sounding like an old fuddy-duddy, I am an old-fashioned social scientist in that I take the Durkheimian and Comtean vision. So, Emile Durkheim is usually called the father of sociology, because he set it on a course of analyzing society as an object in itself. He famously said, social facts are real, and real in their consequences. So we view a social fact as something objective, not as something subjective to be experienced. So to make that practical, if we study racism, we should be able to define racism and observe it as something out there in the world that we can pin down with data, as opposed to viewing it as something that must be subjectively experienced. Now, that old-fashioned view of the social sciences has radically shifted. At the beginning started, sorry to blame the baby boomers, those of you baby boomers present, but it started with the baby boom generation when they went into the academy in the 1960s as students, then in the 1970s as academics, challenging that scientific orthodoxy in the social sciences. And then their students, the baby boomers had at least the advantage that they were educated in the idea of objective social science, and they wanted to make social science a tool for reform. However, their students grew up in an environment where they were discouraged from seeking objectivity in the first place. And so much like journalism, the social sciences have come to have a mission. And thus, I find it not surprising that when I look at an area like Indian democracy that is highly controversial, most of the people in that area, whether they're journalists or if they're even social scientists, are there to promote a cause, to promote social justice as they see it, as opposed to attempting simply to ascertain what the reality of the situation, wherever the chips may fall. Now, I want to be very frank. It's very difficult to be objective. None of us are fully objective. None of us accomplish it entirely. The issue here is not an absolutist one of should we be objective or subjective. The issue here is which should we strive for? What is our goal? And I'm very committed to the idea that our goal should be to attempt, yes, we acknowledge all of the challenges, we acknowledge all of our subjective biases, but our goal is objectivity, as opposed to the dominant position in the field today, which is that the goal is to embrace the subjectivity that subjectivists feel is unavoidable.
Yes, and you also mentioned how when we look at Indian democracy, many of the intellectuals and sociologists and journalists want to kind of project an idea onto it. I want to come to this question from another point of view. You have looked at India, and in the recent past, far more so. What is the quantitative insights that you are getting? For one, if Indian democracy, the nature of Indian democracy, is very different than the Western democracy, and that's why the West is getting it wrong to see democracy in action in India. That is the part one of the question. And secondly, if it is different, oh, sorry, shouldn't I ask you? Because I'll ask one question at a time.
I want to even go back and let me re-emphasize, just to make things, I should always give practical examples, and I apologize I didn't. But it's always, for me, it's always about the data. It's not about the quantitative data. It's about the data. And for more recent periods where we do have quantitative data, of course, I'd like to rely or give preference to the solid quantitative data we have over anecdotal data. Anecdotal data is data, but I would prefer to have solid quantitative data. So, for example, Pew Research Center has done this major survey, 29,999 households of religion in India. If on that survey, ordinary Muslims tell me that there's very little discrimination against Muslims in India, I preference that over one person coming to me and saying, I'm Muslim and I've faced discrimination. Now, that's not to doubt that story of discrimination, right? And there's no reason to believe that the person who experienced discrimination, that person probably did experience discrimination. But in a country of 1.4 billion people, I can find something that's happened to anybody. I'd like to have the systematic data, but I emphasize where systematic data are not available, we try to find whatever data we can. And I'll just give one more example. We don't have data on freedom of the press. There's no such thing. You can't quantify freedom of the press, but we do have data on journalist deaths. All right, well, it's not exactly the same thing, but we can quantify number of journalists who die in the performance of their work as journalists. We can use that. Of course, we have to interpret it carefully, because a journalist being killed by an angry, as has the recent case, by an angry, corrupt person whose corruption was exposed, and the person who's engaged in corruption runs over the journalist with his SUV. That's not exactly repression of the free press, is it? That's a common homicide. So we have to be careful with using the data. But if we have data, we want to use it.
Thank you for the answer. I wanted to kind of pick up on one of the things that you said. Here, exactly what I wanted to ask is that Indian democracy, the nature of it, the way it is kind of practiced in India, is it different than the West? And therefore, measuring the democratic freedom in India is difficult using the same category and lenses. And that's why I was using that as a question on the category, that from where do we come to the category, and whether that category actually captures the reality on the ground. Would like to hear about Indian democracy.
4 years of intensive study have convinced me that Indian democracy is not fundamentally different in character from Western European or American democracy, which is to say there's variability in the way countries conduct their democracies. Indian democracy fits within that overall variability of Western democracy. Yes, there are small, we can point to small differences in practice, but everything that seems distinctive about Indian democracy, we can find in practice in some other country in the West that is widely accepted as being democratic. What's different about India is not its democracy, What's different is its society. So Indian democracy is being conducted in a very different social milieu from that in which Swedish or Australian or American democracy is being conducted. And we can see that immediately, even without reference to India. American democracy is conducted within a cutthroat, competitive, highly violent society. Swedish democracy is conducted within a broadly consensus-based society. And so we see very different norms of democracy in Sweden or the United States, yet we accept them both as being democratic. Well, Indian democracy is being conducted within a society that is extraordinarily poorer than that of any other major global democracy. And when I say extraordinarily, I mean by a factor of 10. It's not slightly poorer. It has 1/10 the income levels of the poorest democracies, well-institutionalized democracies in the rest of the world. On top of that, Indian society is highly religious. So again, levels of religiosity in India, the number of people who say they pray every day, or you can use any other measure you want of religiosity, are much higher in India than in any other democracy. I mean, political scientists have often said, their political sociologists have often remarked that American democracy is distinctive from all the other Western democracies because America is such a religious country. Well, India is an extraordinarily more religious country than the United States. It puts it off the scale. But those aren't about its democracy. Those are about its society. And so we would expect the same phenomenon, the same institutional forms of democracy to look different if they're being conducted in a poor religious society than if they're being conducted in a rich secular society. And I think that's the key to understanding these differences between what we think of as democracy in India and what we think of as democracy in the West.
Thank you. I'm just going to go towards more from the discussion of democracy to more on the Indian economics. And in last 10 years, the economic growth in India, with whatever the pace at which it is happening, has given certain kind of sociological benefits to India. Some kind of some things are changing. From your perspective, quantitatively, what are the measurable things that we see that in last 10 years of economic growth have differed? And I have a follow-up question to this, so I will come to that after I hear more about sociological benefits of the last 10 years of economic growth in India.
Look, all of my training has been in economic development in middle income and specifically in post-socialist transition economies. I only started writing about democracy the last 5 years, and that was primarily in response to the Donald Trump phenomenon. And so I wrote a Trump book in the US, and then I started working on the Indian economy professionally, and then I realized, no, the big story here is democracy. So I feel very comfortable talking about economic growth. Look, the growth rates in the last 10 years have been slower than the growth rate in the previous 10 years. So the Congress-led government 2004 to 2014 actually had slightly higher rates of growth. Now we can quibble over this because they had the global financial crisis while the BJP had COVID. We can pull out financial crisis years and COVID years. We still get that same overall story. And I don't think there's much to be made of that. Of course, politically, an enormous amount is made of that. But practically speaking, India started poorer in 2004, so its growth was faster. And as India has become richer, its growth is slowly slowing down because growth gets harder and harder the richer a country gets. Just look at China right now, which has reached middle income status and growth has virtually stopped. However, people point to things like, or even Mr. Modi himself in his recent speech in Lok Sabha pointed out that we built this many miles of railroad, whereas Congress struggled to build in such smaller. Well, yes, that's because Indian railways are now building from a point that Congress had built this much railway. It's easier to build on top of that than to build the first miles of railway. So there's really not much to see here. And in fact, economic growth in India probably has had very little relationship to who has been in government. It's much more a story of broad liberalization. The liberalization of the Indian economy after 1991 has been yielding dividends ever since 1991, and it will continue to yield dividends, whoever's in power, until India reaches middle income status, at which point growth will become much more difficult.
Yes, and I mean, one of the observations from the qualitative side, and for a long time, even from certain kind of quantitative indicators are showing that Indian agriculture has enormous possibilities. Because India is a country that produces and consumes agricultural produce to a very, very large extent. The unlocking of the value creation in that is still yet to happen. It is just opened up, but there are multiple possibilities. And you have also kind of recognized that sector as one of the possibilities and a differentiator than how the economic growth will happen in the West versus what could be possible in India. Would like to hear more about that from you in terms of what is the evidence and what could be the repercussions if India pays attention to the agriculture sector for as a growth engine.
Look, in 2017, I co-authored a book called "Bricks or Bust: Escaping the Middle Income Trap" with the late German economist. He just passed away, Hartmut Elsenhans. I wrote the India chapter and the China chapter of that book. And look, and I encourage you to get it. I think everything we said is pretty much still true today. Changes being made. Look, India, in order to become a developed or even a middle-income country, has to cut the number of people engaged in agriculture from its current over 40% of the workforce to under 10%, right? I mean, fundamentally, one way or another, we can debate what the best way to do that is, but India cannot be a middle-income country and still have 45% of its population engaged in agriculture. It is inconceivable. No other country has done that. Every country's growth path to development involves getting people off the land. Now, there are good and bad ways of getting people off the land. This is a subject of much debate. Should people be forced off the land? Should people be paid? I mean, we can go into mechanisms. We can debate whether the BJP's proposed, not proposed, the BJP's 3 farm laws, which were later withdrawn, whether those would have constituted a good reform of Indian agriculture. There's lots of debate over this. But no major political party in India seems to me to have yet accepted just the basic fact that several hundred million people who currently live on farms, in order for India to develop, must eventually end up living in towns and cities. Mechanism we can debate. The end goal has to be that there has to be consolidation of farming in India, or India will stall out as a lower middle income country. There's just no way around that. I can talk about different countries and their mechanisms for doing this. The mechanisms were very different in Korea and Taiwan than they were in China. But some mechanism has to occur in order for India to become a developed country.
These mechanisms will be shaped by, on one hand, with the sheer aspiration that Indian demographic dividend will have, and what they do with those aspirations, whether they get certain space to express that, and the political narratives that will come in the space. I want to kind of move towards the next question, which is, again, going back to the disciplinary thing. We saw with India's tax and with the kind of digital data that India is creating, especially in the economic sector, a lot of data is now available. So will it create a better computational sociological space where we could actually understand India better because there is more data? And going forward, are there any insights on what kind of data governance, data infrastructure that India would need to have more relatively unbiased data or unbiased insights for India's progress, like to chart the pathway? And if you could, from your experience, if you could look at these two things, it would be very helpful.
I know I'm talking to a lot of data scientists, so I should be very clear that I'm a statistical social scientist, not a computational social scientist. There may be opportunities for computational social science that I haven't yet imagined that could be enabled by the availability of administrative data sets in India. I really haven't thought that through. The kinds of the implications of the availability of large administrative data sets are generally useful for micro policy questions. So for answering, I don't want to say simple questions. All these questions are difficult, but for answering detailed questions about how should a policy be formulated to best allow a farmer to make greatest use of his resources, right? Those sorts of questions. That's not the sort of question that I ask. The questions I'm asking really involve either survey data or broad country level data. For instance, data about the overall economy, data about the election results, which aren't really machine learning sort of databases. What I would encourage India to do is just produce and release more data. Typically, data is out of date. All of you are probably aware that the Indian census was indefinitely postponed, the census that should have occurred in 2021. So when we look for census data on India, we have to go back to 2011. The idea of a caste census has become thoroughly politicized in India. So from my standpoint as a statistical social scientist, what I'd like to have is a census. Ideally, I'd like to have a caste census piggybacking on the national census, not for political purposes, but because we'd like to be able to analyze the data about people's self-identified caste identities. I would like to have the government take that Pew Religion in India survey, which was conducted by Pew in 2019, 2020, and buried by them. I mean, they did not like the results they got, so they made very little noise about them. I think more people know about the Pew Religion in India survey because of me than know of it because of Pew, because I've used the data and I've pushed it out. Now I've seen it bubbling into other venues and Indian journalists making use of it. I think the government of India would do well to commission that survey every 3 years. Right? Just say, well, it costs $2 million. Great. For the data on religion in India, we need that. Let's redo the survey every 2 years and use its results to help guide policy formation. I would like to see the government take over producing data about journalist deaths right now. And I spoke to Mr. Modi personally about this when he visited Sydney. Right now, that data is created by a Committee to Protect Journalists, a highly political NGO that is, I think, very opposed to the current government in India. Well, shouldn't the government want to have data on journalists who lose their lives and detailed information about the case? Well, the government can produce the data. Then instead of the world seeing that data through the lens that CPJ chooses to put on it, and only a truly aggressive person can go beyond their lens to see the actual data. Government should just collect the data and publish it every year. It'd be great. So I'd like to see just more generation of basic social scientific data about India on a regular routine basis that's published every year, that is accessible to social scientists, journalists, and the wider public. I think that would do wonders for India and its place in the world, because I've become convinced through the detailed research I've been doing on India that the India reality is much, much better than the India story, which implies that if you get the data out there, the story will improve, not because of any propaganda, but because the reality just becomes more accessible.
Oh, I think that's a fantastic insight. There are others who would like to ask you questions more on the methodology and the topics. Ruju, my colleague and my alum friend, is going to ask the next set of questions. Just to kind of end my section of questions, you're a professor, you're in academics, but you're also now leading a think tank. And that would be my last question. That audience would really like to know about the think tank that you chair and you have founded, and what are the goals of that think tank, and what you would wish to kind of do as part of that kind of bringing those minds together.
I developed a think tank in collaboration with Tony Abbott, who's the former Prime Minister of Australia. Tony is fond of saying that if there's to be a leader of the free world in the 21st century, it's going to be India. Now, I think he exaggerates that. I think that the free world is going to be driven forward by the US and India collaborating in a way similar to that which the US and Europe collaborated in the second half of the 20th century. I think Europe is clearly a declining part of the world that is less and less engaged in world affairs. India is a rising part of the world that is increasingly engaged in world affairs. And I'd like to see that U.S.-India partnership drive forward the agenda of the free world. The problem is that the U.S. and the rest of the Western world has just a very poor understanding of India, and their limited understanding of India, such as it is almost entirely filtered through, well, through people like you, through Indians abroad, people of Indian origin. And I don't mean any offense to people of Indian origin, but overwhelmingly, they present a personally subjective view of India to the world. I don't think there's any organization out there that is systematically presenting an objective view of India to the world. Everyone seems to have their own political axe to grind in this space, or if not an axe to grind, at least their own personal motivations and experiences. Tony and I are coming to this with no personal motivation and experience. All we want is for there to be a better world in the 21st century, and we're both convinced that India is going to be an important part of that. And so we've put together this think tank. We've got some very eminent Australians to join the board of directors. We're working to get Australian corporations involved in doing this. We think Australia is actually a very good place to lead this because Australia is broadly respected in the world, but much less politicized than the United States. I talked to colleagues in the US about this, and they said, well, you pretty much either have to be a Democratic think tank or a Republican think tank. I said, no, we just want to be a think tank. We don't want to have to take a side on political issues. So we've put together the organization, the website. We're incorporated. Of course, we're not for profit. We've raised a little bit of money, mostly through small donations, almost entirely actually through small donations. So we've raised about 80,000 Australian, about 60,000 US dollars so far, which is enough to pay our bills and commission research. But ideally, we'd like to be able to pay salaries, and have actual salaried staff, and we're working towards that. We'll see how it goes. If any of you want to donate $2 million to endow a think tank, let me know, and I'll put you in touch with Tony.
Oh, this is thank you for your answers. Now I'll invite Ruju, who is my friend and colleague, and he will be asking the next set of questions. We are in the space of debating with data and perceptions and how they kind of put check and balance on each other. Whatever the perception is, whether it's validated by data, and whether whatever is data are our perception guiding what kind of data are we excavating. And I think there's a continuous debate that will be going back and forth on that. But thank you for your answers, and over to you, Ruju.
Thank you, Dnyanada. I just wanted to start off from what you were just mentioning, Professor, is that the lens into India is kind of controlled by a group of uh, let's say journalists or people with vested interests.
Intellectuals. Yeah.
Intellectuals. And what do you think, in your opinion, is the biggest perception barrier that the West has? Because now we've got Twitter, now we've got YouTube podcast, and slowly but surely the world is kind of opening up onto, in any country if you go, you can get the ground perspective much faster than what it used to be 10 years ago. So what is the biggest perception barrier that the West might have regarding India, and how do we overcome it?
The biggest problem is that knowledge of India in the West is almost entirely mediated by people of Indian origin. And I know most of you are of Indian origin. I don't mean to disparage you. But the problem is that means interacting with a very narrow social class. Right? So I put it to people when we talk about views of the Indian National Congress and the Bharatiya Janata Party, INC and BJP in the West. And I put it to people, if you're an editor at the New York Times, who are you likely to run into at a cocktail party in the Hamptons? Are you likely to run into Rahul Gandhi, or are you likely to run into Mohan Bhagwat? And of course, the whole idea of running into Mohan Bhagwat at a cocktail party in the Hamptons is so ridiculous, as to be laughable, because the class of Indians who are likely to interact with American journalists or British journalists at a social level comes from a very narrow stratum of largely Western educated, of course, English speaking Indians who form the old establishment in India. Now, that's slowly changing with the rise of New India through the tech world. And so there are lots of extremely successful Indians who haven't come through that Oxbridge Humanities or Inns of Court, London Inns of Court formational system, and who are coming from other routes, from engineering routes, from IITs into elite American and British discourses. And 20 years from now, that will have changed the whole, probably changed the whole layout of the land. But for right now, the opinion, simply the general impressions of India that you see at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, even the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Review, the Financial Times in London, all of that comes from the personal experiences of people. And that bias, of course, colors how they view the data coming out of India. They pick and choose data to fit the bias they have. Now, I want to contrast that. I was at the Aspen Security Forum, the big US security conclave in Colorado every July. At the Aspen Security Forum, there was a China panel followed by an India panel. The China panel had 4 top American experts, none of them of Chinese origin. I want to emphasize there's nothing wrong with being of Chinese origin. I'm not saying all you Indians are the problem, right? Nothing like that. I'm just talking about where our knowledge comes from. So our knowledge of China comes from non-Chinese, non-emigre Americans who study China. The India panel was 1 Pakistani American, 1 Muslim Indian, and 2 Hindu Indians, all 3 Indian citizens on the panel telling us about India. Well, where are the India experts, right? There's no problem with an expert being of Indian origin. Of course, it's not a problem, but it's very telling that the entire view of India being received by the American elite is a subjective view of people who grew up there, have families from there, who are telling us about their personal experience of India, as opposed to our knowledge of China is coming from hard-nosed people who are studying China as an external object. That, in a nutshell, is the problem. And that's why our view of India is so skewed. It's so skewed towards the views and experiences of a very narrow group of Indians.
Oh, okay. I'll be turning towards a few questions on economics because I was studying a bunch of your papers, Professor, and also 2 podcasts. And I remember vividly it was one particular podcast where you put a very nice comparison saying that India's economy is kind of doing a catch up with its sociology.
Yeah.
And that struck me on a different note because that's the first time somebody ever put it that way. So could you elaborate more on that? And I mean, how does that work? How does economy catch up to sociology?
Look, the standard theory of growth in economics today is what's called endogenous growth theory or new growth theory. It rose in the 1990s and has now become the standard approach to studying economic growth. It's not my own approach, okay, but it's arisen in the economics profession. And the idea is that a country will grow into equilibrium with its institutions. So if a country has good institutions, but a poorly performing economy, we would expect it to grow. And if a country has badly performing institutions, but a high economic output, we would expect it to go into relative decline. The problem is that economists have defined good institutions solely, I think, through the ideological blinders of the economics profession as meaning low corruption and high marketization. That is, they've taken a neoliberal lens to what good institutions mean and have not thought more broadly. That said, there's some, Robert Barrow in particular, who focused on education, who said education should be the prime predictor of growth. However, they have not been able to operationalize many of the variables we need. So if you go, I mean, all of us working in this space use the World Bank's World Development Indicators. It's the only cross-nationally comparable source of data for most of the kinds of items we want. And they have some very basic things like percentage of the population who has a university degree, percentage of population engaged in agriculture, corruption perception index. And so we have to use these variables because they're the only variables we have. Well, I think we can do the thought experiment and do better than the regression models would suggest. So, for example, in 2019, India had roughly the same GDP per capita as sub-Saharan Africa taken as a whole, the whole region of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it has a panoply of different governance institutions, 40-something countries. It has very low levels of integration. It has no continent-wide road network. It's difficult to move goods from country to country due to internal barriers. There's not a single IIT level university outside South Africa in sub-Saharan Africa. We might argue over the South African universities. We might leave South Africa, and between South Africa and, well, probably not even in Egypt, probably, there's no IIT level university. Well, when I look at that, I think, how can India be as poor as sub-Saharan Africa? And the reason is that India is bouncing back from centuries of bad management under British colonialism, bad management under Nehruvian socialism. You remove the lid in 1991, the economy just starts to grow to match the society. That is, India has a well-ordered society. There are no major internal barriers to trade. There's a relatively large educated population available in India. India has a lot of the attributes of a country that is much more developed than, say, Kenya or Nigeria. And so why isn't it much richer? Well, because the government policy was so restrictive. Remove that, the economy bounces up. It's the same story as in China. In China in 1981, remove the lid, the economy bounces up. The difference is that the Chinese government, being a totalitarian government, removed the lid much more aggressively, at least in certain areas. The Indian government has removed the lid more haltingly because India is a democracy. It's slower to change. Farm reform especially has been much slower in India than it was in China. So transforming farming from a managed economy to a market economy still has not really occurred in India, but it occurred in China 20, 30 years ago, right? So India's behind, it's 10 years behind in that trajectory because it started later. And it's moving a little more slowly along the tree, with the net result that India is about 15 years behind China on this curve. India's GDP today is roughly what China's was at the time of the Beijing Olympics in 2008, 2009, around that time. But I think we can forecast that India will still continue to grow rapidly because India's institutions are still well ahead of its economy. I mean, India still has an economy. Now India has reached the level of Africa as a whole. Not the level, it's now richer than sub-Saharan Africa, but it's still very poor by global standards. It's going to get richer. It's that simple.
Can you put like a definitive number on that? I know it's very difficult, but like right now we're
It's not that difficult.
27.
So from a statistical standpoint, it's not that difficult because statistically, if you take endogenous growth theory to its logical conclusion, and very few economists have actually done this, it implies a model of regression to the mean. So if India simply removes the restrictions that had been in place, the license Raj, if you simply get rid of the restrictions, we would expect India to converge to middle income status, which would be roughly $10,000 a year GDP. At that point, very few countries have ever developed from that level to become richer since the world economy coalesced in the 19th century. So the countries that are mostly rich today are countries that were rich 200 years ago, right? They were rich at the beginning of global, and we can get into deep history if you want later. But in terms of modern history, Taiwan and South Korea are really the only cases of high upward mobility. Japan, Taiwan, and Korea are the only three cases of high upward mobility. So India will get to middle income status. It'll reach $10,000 GDP. And like China reached $10,000 GDP and hit a brick wall. And that's where it's going to stay because China has not made the difficult reforms that would lift it out of the middle income trap. India is still entering the middle income trap, right? So India is in a position where it hasn't yet reached the middle income trap. It's not middle income yet, Once India reaches middle income, then growth gets very difficult, and that would be around 2035, 2037, certainly by 2040. Until 2040, the growth is baked in.
Coming on that line, I'd like to ask, in one of your papers, you talk about countries and, the core and zones and the periphery and how countries move from the periphery into the core. You've also talked about, a particular thing where India's government needs to look for the next generation of global value chains and see that India can get in on the ground floor. That was 5 years back. That was paper from 2018, if I'm not wrong. How do you see the growth 5 years on? And what are your additions to it or recommendations for it?
Obviously, India is succeeding in integrating itself into global technology value chains. India is already sorry, about to sneeze. India is already a relatively successful export economy. So people look to Bangladesh. Many people in India look to Bangladesh and say, why can't India replicate Bangladesh's success in low-wage manufacturing exports? They don't seem to realize that India has a higher percentage of exports as a percent of GDP than Bangladesh does. So India is already more of an export-oriented economy than Bangladesh, despite the fact that India is a much larger country. And typically large countries have much less export orientation just because they're large, meaning that, if you send goods from, Gujarat to West Bengal, that's not an export. But if you send goods from Bangladesh to Thailand, that is an export, right? So there's a bias that in the data that small countries tend to look more like high exporters when they're not necessarily, if you adjust for the size of the country. So India is already an export-oriented economy. India's largest exports are refined petroleum products and cut diamonds. So what India is doing is taking raw materials, transforming them into processed materials. So it's importing the diamonds, it's importing the oil, and exporting the transformed materials. So India's already in those value chains. They're just not the typical story value chains of, garment manufacturing leads to electronics assembly, leads to, well, that was East Asia's path. That doesn't have to be India's path. So India's path might be up through the development of petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals, and becoming a major, innovative chemicals and material science exporter. India is already, of course, climbing the path from routine IT outsourcing through app development, and that will ultimately lead to software. Well, it has already led to software exports and software services exports. So, India is doing this. I know I'm not a strategist. I can't tell you which value chains India will climb and which are not productive to climb. All I can do is point out to people that it doesn't have to be garments, right? There are many paths up value chains, and India is already engaged in those paths.
In one of your papers or one of your podcasts, I did notice that you had a different perspective, and you kind of explained it a bit right now. Uh, Traditional economists tend to still emphasize on the 70s 80s kind of growth which the Asian tigers achieve, which is industrialization. And you say that that is not the path required for India, where India gets into a manufacturing economy completely, and what it can do is augment. I don't know if I'm paraphrasing you wrong, but augment services and manufacturing or something of that sort. So, could you please elaborate more on that?
Look, it's always a challenge to look beyond individual cases to general principles. So someone who looks at just Taiwan's growth will say that the way to grow is to manufacture toys, and then you move from toys to electronics to control toys to then video games, then to, okay, if you're looking at Hong Kong, you think, oh, the path is that you should develop low-wage garment manufacturing, and then you go from garment manufacturing to garment design and outsourcing, and then you go, so, but if you generalize these experiences, you realize that, no, the path is to move from agriculture through industry to services. And that's not my insight. That's something that people have known Well, since Rostov and the mid 20th century development economists who really founded the field. The specific question of how is very difficult, and I don't think that the people who've observed how Hong Kong did it really know how India should do it. Because all they're saying is, Hong Kong did this, you should do this. And they're not realizing that, well, Ethiopia has been a garments exporter now for 30 years, and it hasn't led to much development in Ethiopia. Bangladesh has been a garments exporter for 20 years. It hasn't led to much follow-on development in Bangladesh, right? So the problem is the economy is always moving. What if any of us knew what the leading growth sector was going to be in the next 20, 30 years, we'd be investing in it, not talking about it on a podcast, right? So I don't pretend to be a business person. I can't tell you what the sector will be. All I can tell you is the macro level fact that there has to be a transition from agriculture to higher value added activities. And I can also assure you that that will not lead to mass unemployment. So the folk theory that what India needs is industries that can absorb large numbers of people, that folk theory just ignores the fact that we've never had an economy that developed mass unemployment. I mean, we've been talking about that risk ever since the 19th century, when people were afraid that bringing machines into garment factories would lead to mass unemployment in England. It's never happened. It's not going to happen in India. What's going to happen is that as people move off agriculture, they'll engage in other forms of employment because the economy will be richer, more developed, and better able to employ them.
Not to cut the flow, but we are technically at time, but we have time on our end. So
Sure.
I don't know if you could spare
whatever you want, all yours.
Okay, so we'll maybe go on for 10-ish, 15 minutes, but yeah, we don't want to steal too much of your time. Back to you, Ruju, and I'll conclude with a couple of thoughts. So just leave me 2-3 minutes at the end, but over back to you, Ruju.
Okay. So, I mean, to summarize, you are saying that India is, India needs the economic example of its own, and it can't really copy paste or, try to fit a square plug into a round hole, something like that.
Yeah, I take a very Hayekian view to economic dynamism, and if at the macro level we know that there's profit opportunities there, the business people will find what they are, right? I don't think we can plan this and decide what sectors will be the growth sectors of the next century. Business people will find those.
Oh, so the last question from my side particularly is that why is India so diverse? I mean, economically, we are such a wide spectrum. Culturally, we are such a wide spectrum. Linguistically, we are such a wide spectrum. Geographically, we have got 6 different topographies in the same geographical landmass. Um, why is it that uh, we are so diverse? I mean, we are the same country that can have a very successful space program and missiles program, but we also have multidimensional poverty. Um, is there any other example which has these such a wide economic, cultural, so on and so forth spectrum? And do you think it will kind of coalesce in the future?
Look, India is diverse because India is India. In the 1920s, in the wake of World War I, we saw the breakup of the Ottoman Empire along linguistic lines. We saw the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire along linguistic lines, of the Russian Empire along linguistic lines. And many in India's independence movement were very afraid that the same thing would happen to British India, that the British Empire in India would break up into an independent Bengal, an independent Maharashtra, an independent Tamil, Madras. Each of the major linguistic areas of India would simply become a country. And the fact that that didn't happen in India is due to the efforts of India's nation builders to create a unified Indian nation. That was their vision and desire for India that you have inherited. And you could very well, I mean, there's no law of social development that meant that India in 1947 had to become 2 countries, India and Pakistan, instead of becoming 6, 8, or 12 countries. It's because of the efforts of individuals whose vision for Indian nationhood was that of a unified, subcontinent-wide nation, with the result that these highly disparate areas are knit together into a single nation instead of forming a dozen separate smaller nations. So the diversity, it's there because your ancestors wanted it there, not for really any other reason. Now, as for the diversity of income levels, diversity of development levels, that goes right back to, many of you will have heard of Simon Kuznets, the famous economist who wrote about income inequality, saying that as countries develop from very poor to more developed status, they'll go through a curve where some areas will develop first. So essentially people in the initial phase, everyone's engaged in agriculture. As the country develops, fewer people engage in agriculture, and then in the end, very few people are in agriculture. And during that transition, there was a wide disparity in incomes and levels of development. And India is in that transition now. So why does India have such extraordinary inequality? Not quantitatively, the Gini coefficient of India is not especially large, but qualitatively, some people are doing subsistence farming while others are developing moon probes. How is that true? Yeah, because India is in the process of shifting from one character of society, one character of economy to another character of economy, and that transition will take half a century or maybe a century. And then when it's over, you'll find that there's virtually no poverty in India and that there's virtually no one living on the farm. And you'll have very different problems of poverty. Like the United States, there's no organic poverty in the United States, but there's lots of homelessness. Why? Well, because the system works in such a way that people who receive benefits that are several times India's GDP per capita, nonetheless in the American context, end up homeless. But homelessness on the streets of San Diego is a very different form of poverty from Bihari agriculture poverty.
Well, let's hope we take less than 50 years and definitely not 100. I'll be taking some audience questions now, so feel free to add your questions, dear viewers, in the chat. I have one from Kamini, which asks, how do you think we can maintain the veracity and independence of the data which is undertaken and published by the government?
I've seen very little evidence and very few claims that government India data are biased. I've found one example in the Global Hunger Index data provided by the government of India in 2014. This was the previous government of India just before the election, that seems to have been politically manipulated. But look, data are politically manipulated everywhere. I've seen no credible evidence or allegations that the data are more manipulated in India than they are in other democratic countries. It's just not a serious problem. I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm sure you can point to data where somebody has manipulated the data coming out of government, but it doesn't seem to be a systemic problem.
Okay. I have another one from Kamini, which asks that we have not declared our poverty number since 2011. How do you think this will affect our efforts to alleviate poverty and redistribute wealth?
It's a serious problem. Look, India needs a census. It's that simple. Australia does a census every 5 years, right? It's a fantastic tool for driving data-informed policy. You have to have a census. Now, the United States does it every 10 years, but with a huge survey every year called the Current Population Survey. That's why the US gets away with every 10 years for a census. India, being a relatively poor country, might only want to do a census every 10 years. I would hope it does a census every 5 years or adopts a US-style census every 10 years plus major survey every year to top up the census data. But the questioner is right. Without recent data, it's impossible in a country changing as rapidly, a country as dynamic as India, to make good policy. You need the data to drive the policy.
Uh, this is just a question from me. Is there any model where countries have, taken interested parties who want data and use that to fund more, more rigorous census? Because census in a country like India is a very massive program and requires a lot of government funds.
Look, not a census as such. A census is almost by definition a government activity. But in the United States, there are non-government organizations that provide much of the foundational data. For example, data on manufacturing largely comes from the National Association of Manufacturers, which conducts its own surveys. I'm sure that Indian industry associations do something similar, but I'm not that familiar with industry data in India. But ultimately, social data on things like poverty, literacy, um, uh, education levels, receipt of benefits. Fundamentally, that's a government task. And I think it's really, if I were to criticize the current government of India for one thing, it would be from a social science standpoint, it would be for seeming to politicize the census. The only reason I can think of why the Indian government has not conducted a census in the years since 2021, obviously there was COVID, but it's been a few years now, and there's still no census, is that it's waiting for the election because it wants to bundle the census into a reapportionment of seats in the Lok Sabha. And I think that that kind of political motivation has no place in the collection of social science data.
The last question that I have is, and I'm going to paraphrase it a bit, is there are many areas in India where we don't have quantitative data. For example, rain-fed agriculture. So, what is the best way to study such areas under quantitative sociology?
Look, I'm not an agronomist or an agricultural economist. I'm not that familiar with agricultural data. The United States has a census of agriculture that's done, I think, in conjunction with the decennial census. I'm not that familiar with it. India could also do a census of agriculture. Really, data collection is so cheap from the standpoint of a government budget compared to what it spends on programs that there's really no excuse for governments not to develop the data infrastructure that would help both government and industry, government drive policy, but help industry also promote more effective economic development. Fundamentally, it's a government job.
Well, I think we are done with audience questions. Thank you so much, Professor. We loved your objective take on so many things, and I'll hand over to Abhishek for the closure.
Yes, thank you, Ruju. That was a wonderful session. Great questions, and thank you, Professor, for your insightful answers. I think one question which I had thinking about all of these points was that at JPF Analytics, we say one of our mission points is to promote data cultures. And it was interesting you gave, I had that conversation of objectivity and subjectivity. We were having the same conversation in our group a few days ago. But what mindset do you think shift needs for Indians to go from personal anecdotes to relying upon data? Like, do you have any thoughts about that? Because all of the other things we touched upon, economic change, growth, industry transition, India's future, journalism bias changing, all of the things we covered in the past 1 hour may not come about unless there is a fundamental psychological shift in how people see and interact with data. So do you have any thoughts about that particular point?
This is not an Indian problem. This is a journalism problem. Journalists, quite understandably, focus on the individual case. So many of you will have seen the interview I did with Rajdeep Sardesai, and he said, how can India be a democracy when this person is in jail? And I shrugged my shoulders and I said, well, I don't know why that person's in jail. Maybe there is a good reason. Maybe the person is in jail unjustly. If we want to know, is the system working, we have to have data on how many people have been imprisoned. What are the causes? How many have been politically motivated? Like, we need a systematic approach, not a single case. Now, journalists focus on the case. It's their job. It's what they know. It's their way of motivating people to be interested in the world. I don't criticize journalists for doing that. It's our job to make it easier for journalists to access systematic data. And this is a job we can do as academics. It's also a job the government should be doing. That is, I don't know if any of you tried to work with official Government of India websites to download data, but it's excruciating, right? The data are old, the data aren't well organized. You know, like get in a country that has Tata, Infosys, you know, I mean, get one of them, get HCL in to just like clean it up and make a nice, digestible form of data that people can download. So it's a government's responsibility. It's think tanks' responsibility. That is, those of us who work with data, it's our responsibility to make it accessible to journalists. And I think that's really where we can have an effect. It's not that we're going to counter what journalists say. Journalists want to get to the truth for the most part. It's just that their way of knowing the truth is different from ours. They don't have the time or the expertise to delve into the data. Generally, they rely on people like us to provide the data, to put it up on a website, to give it to them in an interview. And once we do, they'll take it in stride. They'll use that data. So the data culture and the data infrastructure needs to be developed. The journalists will come along once it's there, once it's easy to get.
Okay. Thank you for that. The final.
I'll give you a word of hope. Journalism is disappearing and being replaced by bots. Okay, low-level journalism, a lot of it is now just bots automatically writing stories, on the basis of release. So to the extent that people providing data make it easily digestible, machine readable, in the future, AI, quote unquote, journalists will be taking your data and putting it out there to the public. So the forces of change are really on our side as long as we make the data accessible.
No, thank you for that. A final question which I had, and maybe I'll try to draw in. We have had many other questions from other viewers. I think people are still posting in the comments, but just to summarize, one phrase which always sticks with me is that if you want to improve something, you need to be able to measure it. That's a very classical scientist point of view at all of this. And at the underlying level of all of this is that we don't have good measurements. Fundamentally, in the social sciences, we measure people. And many times, like you mentioned, the caste census, but there might be a colonial lens in the categories that we construe. India is now looking at its demographic bulge, but as we see population rates stagnate and decline as family structures change in the world, measuring people, their identities and their categories, which are often subject to ideology, be it religion, liberalism, wokeism, whatever. So how do you address this particular question of what counts, both pun not intended and intended? How do you count social categories? Yeah, that's the last question.
Look, Jack Welch famously said, the former CEO of GE famously said, what gets measured gets done. And of course, the obvious corollary to that is what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. And so it can really warp our understanding of the world if we only focus on what is conveniently measurable. And that's why I always emphasize that the data we see are just a tip of a larger iceberg. And actually, one of my most cited papers is exactly on this. It's on how we I'm trying to remember the title of my own paper. It's on how we understand the rest of the iceberg, right? We can't know what's there unseen. We have ideas, we have theories of what's there unseen, and we're using the data we can see to project what's below, but we might be grossly incorrect in doing so. So it's something to be cognizant of, that we're not using the data. The data, when people say the data speak for themselves, that's only true of the most trivial questions. Let me make this very practical. Data will tell you how many people have a university degree. What's the quality of that university degree? Who knows, right? We know they have the piece of paper. Well, we'd like to be able to ascertain things that are not measurable, that it's very important for us, important for policy and important for our lives as human beings, to have the rest of that iceberg, the rest of that story. We can only do the best we can with the data we can get. Of course, if you can do a little bit of drilling down to find out what's here in this place, what's here in this place, you can start to build a picture. But we're always attempting to build a picture of something that is fundamentally hidden using the data that happen to be available. And if we remember that, then we can maybe be a little more modest in the claims we make using data, because we're using the data we have to guess, and it's only a guess, as to what the data we don't have look like. That's a big challenge.
Thank you.
Interpretive methods, that's it. I knew it would come to me after I go. Interpretive methods for quantitative social science. So we need to, we're taking an interpretive approach to our data, and that's because we can't do experiments. Those of you who come from the sciences or come from psychology, if you can do a controlled experiment, you don't have to guess at what's there below what you can observe. But if you're using observational data, the interpretive framework is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, that's definitely food for thought. I think this conversation can be never ending, but before we let you go, we do want to take a group picture with everyone else in the team, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I will give everyone a minute or so to turn on their cameras. But yeah, thank you for this whirlwind tour from like the very nitty-gritty details of sociology to practical suggestions and examples of particular cases. I think that was very helpful, often to ground these conversations with examples. We, of course, couldn't take all of the questions that we had, but we would hopefully, if you're up for it, be open to keep this conversation going on, because we learned definitely a lot from you, and we could potentially see doing things together as a team in the future. But lots to
Of
learn.
course, I'd love to hear from people. And also, I'm very easy to find online. Just email me if you want to talk about something further. Any of you, I mean, not just the organizers, but anyone who wants to carry forward the conversation, send me an email. I'm very approachable, very happy to talk.